Hi, friends. John Haverstick here. I've had a number of people inquire about my process for doing the background replacement, the texturizing of backgrounds, and the color grading process that I use. So I thought rather than try and type it all out and hope you understand it from the printed description, I'd just do a quick video to show you how it works. It's actually fairly straightforward, fairly simple once you understand the basic process. So this is sort of the target end result. This is kind of where we're going. And you can see there's a number of layers involved here. We've got a texture layer, we've got a layer mask, a couple of adjustment layers. I have a group of color grading layers as well that involve a couple different types of adjustment layers. But what I want to do is I'm going to just take all this apart back down to the basic original image here and then show you how we build this. So let's delete these layers. And what I have is my starting portrait. Now this process that I use tends to work best if your subject is photographed on a gray background. Now my background that I tend to use for portraits like this is a Savage Translume material. It's kind of like a mylar, plasticky kind of material, diffusion material. It's white. And normally for high key portraits, I light that background from behind. It's translucent like diffusion material. But if I turn off the background light, I get a nice gray for the background. So this is a one light portrait. Key light is camera left and a large octabox and feathered, but no background light. So the gray of the background that you're seeing is just spill light on a white background coming from my key. A little darker would be nice, but my subject's right up against the background, so this is what I have. But gray is important, okay, however you achieve it. The other element to this is a texture file. And you can shoot these yourself. If you have hand-painted backgrounds, you can just photograph them yourself. You can photograph anything. You can do bricks, all kinds of texture, stucco, peeling paint, whatever it is. You can make your own textures very easily. I have a lot of those. I've also got some that I've purchased through companies like French Kiss and Flypaper Textures. There's all kinds of resources for texture backgrounds. But this is one of my favorites. I don't remember if this came from Flypaper or French Kiss, but anyway, this is one I use a lot. And all we're going to do is we're going to drag this texture file onto our portrait image. Okay, so if you're in the tabbed view here in Photoshop as I am, I'm going to use my Move tool, V for the Move tool, drag the layer from the layer panel over to the tab for my portrait image, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key and drag that ghosted layer there down onto the image, the canvas area, and that will drop it in place as a new layer on top of my portrait. Now holding down the Shift key is not necessary, but I've gotten into that habit because that centers the image on the destination image. So I just kind of do that by habit now. Now we do want the background to fit the portrait, so I do need to scale it a little bit here, scale it up. So I'm going to do Free Transform, Command or Control T, Command on the Mac, Control on Windows. And I'm going to hold down the Option key or Alt key on Windows and drag one of the resize handles out. Now holding down the Option key just resizes from the center of the image, so it goes out from the center in all directions. And when we got it to the size we want, we'll just hit Enter to apply. So now I have my background texture layer over top of the image layer. Now here's the trick. This is the trick to getting it to blend. I don't have to make a detailed selection or anything of my subject or of the background. I'm going to go to my layer panel blending modes. By default, the blending mode is always set to normal, which means that there's no real interaction between layers. But if you change the blending mode, you change the way one layer interacts with the layer below it. So I'm going to change the layer blending mode on this texture layer, and what I've found usually works pretty well is soft light. Overlay will work as well. Overlay tends to be a little more contrasty than soft light, but sometimes it's too much. Yeah, if it's too much, you can always lower the opacity of that layer as well. But let's go with soft light for now. It's a little more subtle. We'll tick on soft light there. And you'll notice that the background texture is now being applied to the gray. Now it's also being applied to my subject. If I turn this layer on and off here, you'll see that it's on his skin, his clothing, it's all over the whole image. So while I want it on the background, I obviously don't want it on my subject. So I need to add a layer mask to my texture layer and hide that texture in the areas where I don't want it to appear on my subject. So we'll come down to the bottom of the layer panel and add a layer mask. It's a white filled mask, so it has no effect. Remember when we talk about layer masks, white reveals, black conceals. So I want to paint with black on my mask in the areas where I want to hide the texture. Now you could do this with a brush. You could also use Photoshop's select subject function to make a selection of the subject. But what I find works the best for this is using the gradient tool. It's over here in about the middle of your toolbar. G is the keyboard shortcut to activate the gradient. And we want to paint with black to hide the texture layer. So I need to be sure that my foreground color is set to black, which it is. And I'm going to choose the radial gradient. That's the second gradient option here in the options bar. And I want to be sure that my gradient swatch is set to foreground to transparent, not foreground to background, foreground to transparent. That's the one we want to use because that's going to allow me to build up a cumulative gradient. If I had it set to foreground to background, or black to white, every time I do a new radius, it's going to replace the previous radius. But doing foreground to transparency allows me to build up a cumulative mask here, cumulative radial gradients. So make sure we're clicked on the mask, so we're painting on the mask, and I'm just going to start dragging out little radii. If you kind of keep an eye on the layer mask there, you can see what's happening as well. But you'll notice on the image that everywhere that I draw these little radii in black, we're seeing the texture disappear from our subject. Now, somebody will say, well, John, why don't you use a brush, a soft brush? Well, you could do that too, but what I find is that the radial gradient creates a softer, more feathered edge than even the 0% hardness brushes. So to get really easy, quick blending here, where we don't see an edge of our mask, the radial gradient tool creates this real soft, fuzzy, indistinct edges, which blends perfectly. And I don't have to be super precise about paying attention to edges. I mean, if a little bit of the background bleeds over onto the clothing or the hair or something, you're not going to notice it because it's such a smooth, soft, feathered transition. Now, there we've got the basics done. That's it. That's as far as we need to go really with adding a texture to the background. But if we want to take it a step further, there's some things that we can do here. First of all, I might like my background to be a little bit darker now. Well, thinking now my background is the texture, I'm going to click on that background layer, and I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. Now, this is a non-destructive approach to editing. We're going to add a curves adjustment layer. And I only want the curve to affect the background layer. I don't want it to affect all the layers below it, which is the normal way that adjustment layers work. They affect everything below them in the layer panel. But what I want to do then to affect only the texture layer here is I want to clip this adjustment into the texture layer, into the layer below it. There's a couple ways you can do that, but while you have your properties panel open with the curves adjustment here, there's a little button at the bottom of the curves panel here, that this little square with a angled arrow. If I click that, that's going to clip this adjustment into the layer below it. That means it's only going to affect the layer immediately below it. And you can tell that this is clipped into the layer below by this little bent arrow, and it kind of indents the adjustment layer. So now when I make adjustments to that layer, you'll notice that it doesn't affect my subject, but it does affect the tonality of the background. Now, if I don't want to affect the color of that background, because sometimes curves adjustments will also impact the color as you change them, we can change the layer blending mode of this curves adjustment to luminosity. And that way it's only going to affect the brightness and will have no effect on color whatsoever. So now we can kind of dial in the darkness of that background. The background image, as you can see here, has sort of a natural vignette anyway, so that I don't even have to deal with vignetting because it's part of the image. Now, what if you don't like the color? Maybe you like the texture of that background, but you don't like the color. Well, we can always desaturate the texture layer. You can do it in a variety of ways. The easiest way probably is just to go, and I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut for this, but Image menu, Adjustments, Desaturate, or Command or Control Shift U. That takes the color out but leaves the texture. Okay, so however you like that, this is fine. I'm going to go ahead and leave it desaturated because the next step, and if you want to take it a step further, we can add a bit of color, what we call a color grade. When we talk about color in post-production, there's two sort of realms of color. One is color correction, making sure that your colors are accurate to start with, and that's always a good starting point. The other is color grading, which is applying color in post for creative effect. And that's what we're going to do here. There's a ton of different ways to do this. You can do it directly in Adobe Lightroom or Camera Raw. You can do it in Capture One. And that's kind of where I tend to do it now with the advent of those color grading tools in those programs. But if you want to do it in Photoshop, and again, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. The way I do it is by adding 3 adjustment layers. Now, I've created an action to do this, but I'll walk you through the steps here. So the first adjustment layer is a desaturation, hue saturation layer. So we'll click on that. And again, we're going to affect everything below. That's what we want. We're going to affect everything below in the layer panel. And what I want to do is I want to take the saturation down to about -40. That seems to work pretty well. So around -40. That's going to take some of the color out of the image. Okay. Our next adjustment layer is going to be a curves adjustment layer. And again, it's going to affect everything below it. Now, normally we think of curves typically as a means of adjusting contrast or exposure. Okay? When we are adjusting all 3 red, green, and blue channels together, as is typical with curves, we're adjusting exposure. Right? But you can also go into the individual color channels in your curves adjustment and adjust the brightness or darkness of particular color values. Now, you have to keep in mind here when we do this, the color wheel and the concept of complementary colors. So, for example, if we go into the blue channel here, and this is just accessed through this drop-down menu here that normally says RGB by default, we'll click and choose the blue channel. And as usual, if we drag the curve upward, we add color or add brightness to the image. In this case, add blue to the image. If we drag the curve down, we're removing blue by adding its complementary color. And if you think about your color wheel, or if you think about Capture One or Adobe Lightroom, the white balance sliders, you can visualize the complementary colors. Blue and yellow are complementary. If you add blue, you reduce yellow. If you add yellow, you reduce blue. Complementary colors. Okay. Now we can take that, be a little more specific about that with our color grading efforts here by, say, for example, adding a little blue to the shadow areas of the image by dragging our curves adjustment up a little bit in the slider, or in the shadows, again, only in the blue channel, and adding a little bit of yellow or warmth to our highlights by dragging it down, again, still working the blue channel, decreasing the blue in the highlights, which adds a little warmth to the highlights. Now, because this is an adjustment layer, this is infinitely adjustable and readjustable. If we don't like it later, we can come back and fine-tune it. Okay. So I'm going to add a little blue to the shadows, add a little warmth to the highlights. We could do the same thing with the green channel on this image, messing with the green, which would be adding green if you increase it, adding magenta, which is the complement to green. If you decrease it, that doesn't seem to do anything for this image, so I'm going to skip that. But I'm going to go to the red channel. The complement to red is cyan, which is kind of a bluish green color. And so the same principle applies. I want to add a little bit of cyan to the shadows, and actually a little bit of cyan to the highlights as well. Overall cyan cast. So I'm going to go kind of to the midtones here and just drag this slider down just a tiny bit. I don't want to overdo it. That looks too over the top, but just a tiny subtle adjustment here. Whoops. Bring it down from the middle just a little. There we go. And you can see if we turn this curves adjustment layer on and off here, this is the effect we're having. We're adding a subtle sort of bluish, greenish grade to the whole image. Okay. Now again, if we wanted to do other adjustments, additional vignetting or things like that, we could go further. But this is the basics of the color grading process that I tend to use when I do it in Photoshop. Now again, you can do this kind of thing in Lightroom or Capture One as well with a color grading panel. I'm going to go ahead and group these layers together. Click the first one of the color grade group, and then There is one more thing I forgot. Actually, you can add one more adjustment layer. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference with this particular image, but if we wanted to, we could add a levels adjustment layer on top of this. And kind of like we did with curves, instead of going to adjusting the RGB channel, which is going to adjust the brightness and contrast, we're going to go specifically to the blue channel, and we're going to use the output level sliders here. Dragging the black output towards the right is going to push a little more blue into the shadows, going to lighten the shadows a little bit and give them a little bit of a bluish cast. The highlight output, if we drag it towards the center, it's going to brighten the highlights a little bit and add a little bit of warmth to the highlights. Now, you may or may not like that. Frankly, for me, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Okay, I kind of like it. We'll leave it there. But what I want to do at the end of this, just to kind of keep my layer panel tidy, is to select those 3 layers that make up my color grading group. And I'm going to group them together. Now, the quickest and easiest way to do that is Command or Control G for group, or you could right-click and choose Group from Layers. Either way will work. And give it a name. I'll call it Color Grade. Click OK. And that's just an organizational thing. Okay. But there you have it. We've gone from the straight out of camera look to a little more cinematic color graded look in a few easy steps.